There are so many stupid reasons anti-cycling people bring up as to why we can't increase cycling uptake through simple improvements. These reasons are often hilarious and easily debunked. Oh, we don't have the weather for it, it's too hot, and what happens when it rains or snows? I gotta take my kids to school. How will I do the weekly shopping? What about old people who need to drive? And the most hilarious of all, oh, Europe is flat. They don't have the hills like we do in Australia or the old US of A. Actually, this one makes sense. It's easy for us to look at the Alps in Europe, to laugh at them, and dismiss this claim as ignorant. But even though Switzerland is 2/3 mountainous, the cities are mostly flat. And when we look at other parts of Europe, such as everyone's favourite cycling country, the Netherlands, that country again is famously flat. It's clear that the Dutch cycle only on flat grounds, given their standard Dutch bike is a single-geared bicycle with carrying racks, whilst the Swiss bike has gears to deal with the hills. And for anyone who dares threaten the neutrality and sovereignty of the bike lane, a Panzerfaust is on hand. But what about Switzerland? Surely there are cities amongst those mountains or hills. They can't all cram into the flat lands, you might ask. And that is a good question. And the answer is yes. Swiss cities do have hills, and yes, people still do cycle them. A lot. But the thing is, the hills in Zurich aren't really an impetus to casual or commuter cycling. You'll find casual bike riders of all ages, heavy cargo bikes, and even single-speed bikes in the hills of Zurich. But when you look at my home city of Brisbane, the city is nowhere near as hilly or mountainous as Zurich, but I can assure you, those hills aren't full of people cycling, and neither are they a joy to ride. In fact, they suck mega balls. I'm Streets and Scars, and today we're going to have a look at why a city literally at the foot of large hills and mountains is a lot more enjoyable to ride than a city with much smaller hills. We'll also look at why I'm going to throw fuel onto the already extinguished fire of why grid cities can suck ass, and we'll also find out why you will hear me puffing and panting up this hill on a bike. Science. Zurich is an amazing place to cycle in. It isn't quite Dutch City or Copenhagen level of great cycling infrastructure, but it is on the whole great to cycle. I know Urbanism Jesus Not Just Bikes mentioned that Zurich has some horrible places to cycle, and Switzerland isn't the best place for cycling, but he's not entirely wrong. But the specific streets he referenced are often the exception. The vast majority of the city is quiet streets where a bike lane isn't necessary, and although the painted gutters are quite shitty, fortunately at least, the rather pleasant Swiss drivers respect the yellow line. For any Swiss who disagree, go cycle in English-speaking countries where the yellow painted bicycle gutter means come and die and you have to prove they did something wrong. But as Not Just Bikes wish to see at the end of his video, Switzerland has a lot of potential, and Zurich is living up to that potential, constantly improving city cycling infrastructure and proposing semi-radical plans to improve it further. Not Just Bikes, if you're watching this video, I'm pleased to report that on Kasernenstrasse, the whole right side lane has been converted to bicycle only. We're getting there, though the auto lobby is still strong here, so each bicycle plan has pushback that delays projects. Like many other European cities, Zurich used to be a car brand hellhole. Cars used to be absolutely everywhere in the city, even in the old town streets. Even though Switzerland is a very small country with amazing public transport system, the country has a very high rate of car ownership for its size, with approximately 600 cars per 1,000 people, which is a relatively high rate in Europe. Over the years, the city was consumed by cars, but it slowly fought back and regained control of the streets, and reversed some past mistakes in road design, preferring people over cars, and somehow, it dodged the most drastic, disastrous, heinous road plan a beautiful city like Zurich could ever do, though that will be the topic of another video. Zurich managed to turn streets from this to this, and the city continues to do so every year, especially this one, which will have to be a video for another time along with this mysterious destructive road project. You've probably noticed that every city I've covered has had the topography gradient of water, meaning flat. What about the hills? Anyone can cycle on flat land, I hear you say. For those who haven't noticed, Zurich predominantly lies in the flat area, between the hills and mountain ranges. The space in between these mountains is quite flat, as over millions of years sediment was deposited during floods and glacial movements, creating a nice flat landscape amongst the mountains. From the early settlements up to around the Industrial Revolution, the city grew gradually. With the old town and railway station being the centre of commerce, the city grew around these areas, and slowly but surely, development started to creep up the hills. You can see on maps throughout time that the city slowly grew further and further up the hill. But in lower flatlands, you'll see an interesting phenomenon of urban planning history, before the advent of mass car ownership. What you notice is that to the east of the city on the hill known as Zurichberg, development continued to sprawl, but on the flatland to the west of the city, development just densified, not so much expanded. The dense areas also took on more of a grid-style geometric design, whilst the hilly areas didn't so much, bar a few infill areas. Why you'll find grids in the lower areas and not so much in the hilly areas will become very apparent soon. But let's park that for a moment, because I need to expand on hills, specifically hills and cycling. Do they actually negatively affect commuter cycling rates? The short answer is yes. They do affect commuter cycling rates. I'm going to push back on urbanist Jesus Not Just Bikes here, who cites a paper from Justin Tyndall that says hills are not a contributing factor to cycling rates.
In every city I've ever been to, all around the world, I've seen a direct correlation between cycling safety and the number of people cycling. The hills aren't really a contributing factor, and that has been confirmed by research too.
Whilst, yes, the paper does come to the conclusion that topography plays no role in cycling rates, it doesn't tell the full story about cycling and hilly topography. There's more to it than hills equals bad. In the paper Not Just Bike-Sided, the author mentioned that research done in Belgium, England, and Wales, that hills do in fact have an effect on cycling rates. Oddly enough, it also cites a study done on Dutch cities, showing that the notoriously low and flat country is also affected by, wait for it, hilly terrain. Huh? What hilly terrain? Crossing an arching canal bridge? Oh no, yup, there is a hill in the way. We must take another route. Hilly terrain can have a significant impact on casual or commuter cycling for primarily two reasons. It's hella uncomfortable, and it massively slows you down. Of course, there are people out there who absolutely love taking hills on bikes. Unfortunately, or rather unfortunately, this isn't most people. They just want to get to work, or get to the shops. And if a hill between their home and work means an extra few minutes of arriving sweaty, then of course they'll opt for the car. There are other solutions to riding hills that don't include physical exhaustion, such as e-bikes or regular buses you can put your bike into. Or in Stuttgart, they have this cute little wagon at the front of their tram, train, U-Bahn thingo, where you can put your bike onto and it'll take you up the hill. Or like in Norway, the silly bicycle foot kick machine that yeets you to the top of the hill. These solutions are great, but they have some mega drawbacks. E-bikes are expensive, and even in wealthy Zurich, bike theft is rife. Public transport doesn't go everywhere, nor is it always that great to put your bike inside a busy bus. It also scales bag in peak hour times. And finally, this bicycle yeet machine doesn't scale well. It's tricky to use, not that much faster than just pedaling really fast, and its usable design is somewhat restricted in length and location. In Zurich, bar a few really cool funiculars that let you take bicycles, you don't really need fancy gizmos or novelty solutions because for over 100 years, the solution has been there the whole time. You see, it's not about how high a hill or mountain is, it's the gradient of the climb. When it comes to cycling hills comfortably, gradient is everything. It's a basic principle in physics. If you want to reduce the effort and thus make the ride more comfortable, you have to double the distance. Casual and commuter cyclists have limits, and cycling starts to get really uncomfortable around a 6% grade, depending on how far you ride. Well, we all can't be riding around with legs like Quadzilla Robert Fursterman to yeet us up steep hills with enough power to toast bread. And this is what the paper Not Just Bike cited was talking about. It didn't necessarily say that hills are a barrier to commuter or casual cycling, but rather the steepness of the slopes is the biggest factor. When you have a look at the hilliest parts of Zurich, you'll notice the street design starts to alter itself from straight, geometrically organized streets into elongated curved streets. As an example, you can see the streets in the area of the Hönk region of Zurich are mostly all parallel, with barely any streets going perpendicular apart from a few pedestrian-only stairs. This is because this area is a steep slope, and in order to reduce the gradient, street pathways had to follow the contours. Basically, following the contours means going along the slope, not directly up the slope. This street design reduces a direct up-the-hill average gradient from a soul-busting 26% to around 5%. Yeah, the distance is more than double, but remember, to halve the effort or gradient, we need to double the distance. And half a 26% gradient is still 13%, which is still a bit too uncomfortable for casual commuter cyclists. So I chose a route that's nearly 7 times longer to prove that to bring that gradient down a fair bit to a relaxing 5% average. You're wondering why I started all the way to the east and not right next to the river. Well, the roads don't really cater for direct routes from the bottom of the hill here to the top to allow these cars to drive straight up. And there's a reason for that. I will get there soon. But let's quickly look at Brisbane and see what their steep streets are like. And my golly god, let me introduce you to Gower Street in West Brisbane, with a maximum gradient of around 30%. Yes, I know New Zealand's Baldwin Street holds a title for steepest street in the world, but I'll be referring to Brisbane a lot, so I'll keep it simple. Right, Goa Street. Very steep, very residential. The YouTuber Mitch Boyer tested himself riding up this hill on a very expensive and very light road bicycle, and he peaked himself at just over 700 watts pushing it up the hill, just so he can make a 30-second split. Now, for trained cyclists on specialized equipment using that much power, imagine how a casual commuter cyclist would feel just trying to get to work. And Goa Street isn't just an outlying example, where once you ride it, you're on gentle slopes. No, everywhere else is just crappy, undulating hills. Steep hills like this are everywhere in Brisbane, although predominantly on the western side of the city. It seems like the Brisbane Street Network was designed by masochist cyclists. Once you complete a hill, you have to ride down it and then do it again at the next hill. And this is another factor in discouraging cycling uptake. Steep hills are one thing, but repeated hills just compound the barrier to cycling. As an example, here is my cycling route's terrain profile from my home in Zurich to a major university that is situated on the other side of a valley. It's a gentle slope ride down and then a gentle slope ride back up to the university. Quite relaxed. Able to be done on a single speed bike if I'm feeling adventurous, and most of all, I can keep a steady pace without arriving and dripping in sweat. Now here's my ride from my home where I grew up in Brisbane to my high school. It's just repetitive annoying hills. The path is just constantly going up and down steep hills. It's not fun, it's exhausting, and there are no bike lanes, which makes me more vulnerable on my significantly slower uphill speeds relative to the fast cars. And with frequent hills, it takes longer than it should. Yes, that's correct. Overall, cycling hills slows you down even if you did the equivalent downhill as you do the uphill. Because even though you're a lot faster on the downhill, it still isn't enough to make up the lost time on the uphill. The physics law of conservation says that energy used to cycle up a hill will be saved on the downhill, much like a pendulum. But that's assuming there are no other influences. However, in the real world, we have air resistance that is quadratic as speed increases. There's friction from moving parts that also increase with speed, and a whole bunch of other things. But most importantly, riding a bicycle really fast down suburban roads is absolutely mental and dangerous, especially without a bike lane. And therefore, unfortunately, some of the energy that you stored while going uphill, originally intended to be released during the downhill, now has to be dissipated as heat through your brakes because a lot of bike paths or roads are completely full of danger. So what does this look like in the real world? Well, using my 8 km and in freedom units because some Americans complain they don't understand metric, approximately 20,000 AR-15 barrel lengths long bike ride to high school in Brisbane, Google's Gemini AI estimates the hills add about 10 minutes compared to an equivalent flat route. While 10 minutes might seem minor, factor in the exhaustion, heat, sweat, discomfort, safety concerns, and general annoyance that hills introduce, and it's clear why there can be a significant deterrent to casual or commuter cycling. It might be really hard to verify this information in real-world testing, but I'm pretty sure you get the gist of why Tour de France riders are exceptionally fast on flat ground, and why the most exciting stages are mountain stages where the boys are separated from the men. Steep roads aren't fun on a bicycle, but I find it ironic that when a new highway is built, they actually keep gradients to a minimum. So the engineers that design roads recognize that it's not suitable for large trucks with large and heavy cargo, but somehow they find it acceptable for a low horsepower human. It boggles the mind. And one more thing against steep roads. They don't go well for these bad boys. Unless it's a Lisbon tram. But how is it that Brisbane has street design that is completely inappropriate to its topography, and Switzerland doesn't? What went wrong in Brisbane? Before we get into the why, I need to preface this part by fully acknowledging the difference in topography between Zurich and Brisbane. Zurich has hills and mountains, but the landscape is best described as being river plains where sediment was washed down off the mountains over millions of years to create flat landscapes in between the large rolling hills. Whilst Brisbane's topography has been eroded over millions of more years to create small rippled hills compared with Zurich's large gentle hills. The best way I can describe it is that Switzerland's landscape is a chiseled buff guy's tight abs with definable smooth and visible peaks and troughs, whilst Brisbane's hills are like, well, an old dude's wrinkled scrotum. Look, if you have a less erotic way of describing the differences in topography, I'd like to hear it. Until then, it's abs and scrotums from here on out. What do chiseled abs and old wrinkled scrotums have to do with street design? Well, not much really, apart from the fact that street design difficulty changes depending on which body part you're designing for. The wrinkled scrotum represents a lot of little undulating hills, and designing streets for that is probably overly burdensome, or steep streets are likely unavoidable without major earthworks. But even in the predictable and singular large hills of Zurich, there are a few steep hills you can often come across depending on your daily commute route. And here is where you'll now have to hear my struggling up the steep hill on the way to a top technical university in the world. Actually one where Albert Einstein was a professor in 1912, except at the original central campus, not the Hunkerberg campus where that in 1912 was just a farm. So did Zurich make the same silly mistakes as Brisbane during their street design? Well, yes, but sort of not really. You see, those steep streets where you have to hear my panting and struggling weren't really made for commuter traffic at all when they were first laid. As I mentioned about this place being farmland decades ago, nearly a century ago, no one else came up here except the farmer and probably some hiking dorks. Only the farmer was up here. Only the farmer needed to come here. This was considered the outskirts of Zurich all those years ago. And even though now there is a residential on both sides of the uni, back then, no one went between these two places. It just wasn't necessary because, you see, as the city's residential areas grew outward, it wasn't a growth in farmers on the hills that spurred the housing development. It was a growth of wealthy city white-collar jobs. This is why you won't see a road going directly up the side of this hill, but instead gently radiating up the steep slopes from the city centre. Because workers were primarily going between the city of Zurich and their home. And even before these residential areas were developed, the only roads that existed beforehand were gentle sloped roads going to the old villages. Because these roads had to carry the traffic of horse and cart, unpowered transport, walkers, farmers taking their produce to the city, and so on and so forth. Even when the first internal combustion engine car was created, it was only able to convert about 1 litre of petrol to 0.75 horsepower, making early motorised transport not really viable for steep hills. 0.75 horsepower is already a struggle on flat ground. Imagine how it would do on a hill. This is why most roads are gentle slopes back then, and even now. It cemented this culture and design philosophy of minimizing gradients that inadvertently created a great solution to cycling steep hills. Although these organically developed streets are great for the city commute, they're kind of annoying if you need to traverse these parallel streets with a car. In the modern day, cars can shoot straight up a 20% gradient, no worries. So being forced to drive the long way around is quite annoying, and that's a fair statement to make. This brings me to the question of why grids can be bad for not just cycling, but other things too. I'm going to throw a bit of fire onto the already extinguished flame of beef between Alan Fisher and OBF. We all remember Alan Fisher's video dunking on the YouTube channel OBF. He tried to fallaciously, not fallaciously, justify why grids are all around bad. It was pretty ha-ha worthy to watch those flimsy arguments get dunked on. You can watch the video yourself, but to summarize, OBF just correlated bad urban design like urban heat island effect, traffic, and aesthetic outcomes with grids, when in fact those problems stem from other general planning failures. However, one of OBF's strongest possible points against the grid was his shortest and least expanded point, and that is hills. What OBF said about grids on hills is they're bad because they aren't appropriate for varying topographies, and you'd have to flatten the topography in order to make grids work. There is so much nuance to this argument that he could have expanded on to strengthen his point, but he left himself open to Alan easily and rightfully dunking on him. OBF is correct in saying that applying grid design to steep gradients presents significant challenges, but his point just stops at the amount of earthworks necessary to flatten everything, which we know is not true at all. And actually creating steep roads reduces the amount of earthworks, as you don't need to do cut and fill when you go parallel. What OBF didn't highlight with grids in hilly areas is that they limit the use of longer, heavier trams, create poorly engineered intersection approaches with reduced sightlines for large vehicles, and severely hinder accessibility for people with mobility impairments. These are the actual problems of grids applied to unsuitable topography. Except, the grid itself isn't the problem. It's the rationale of the grid design application. Grid design isn't a new phenomenon. It's rather ancient as evidenced by old Roman settlements, but in the modern world, it has had varied rationales relating to its application. It can keep things orderly, egalitarian, easy to manage infrastructure-wise, and property parcels are easy to divide and survey. Grids are easy and quick to design, and that's why you'll find them in many cities around the world, particularly in what we would call the New World or colonies. But when it came to colonization and development of land in quote-unquote the New World, developers or urban planners, if you could call them that, had little idea about the topography of an area, nor did they really care, because appropriate design costs time and money. They didn't really know the organic pathways developed over years of human settlements in the area, who naturally find the easiest pathways over time. A lot of the times the surveyors tasked with creating the settlement or development pattern just drew a grid because it was just easier. It was quicker than going out to properly survey the topography and creating topography appropriate street design. That's just what surveyors and developers did at the time, which inadvertently resulted in streets going straight up the steepest hills in the area. It's no surprise that the most of the steepest hills in the world are found in English-speaking colonies like the USA, Australia, and New Zealand. Europe, and in particular Zurich, on the other hand, had centuries of human movement that carved predominant pathways through the mountain passages. You see those awesome switchback mountain roads that every twat with a hot-adap Japanese import hoons around on? Do you think the mountaineers created these curves for our automotive fun hundreds of years before the car was invented? No. It was simply the only way to push that crap around steep hills, even if it took longer. And this is what grid design and biking on steep hills have to do with each other. The natural pathways of old established cities were carved out in times when transport was primarily human or animal powered, inadvertently making them easier to navigate in the contemporary world on a bicycle. But when cities were divided up in the New World, they completely disregarded topography as it was just easier as the heavy industry wasn't located on the hilly areas, just residential, so developers didn't need to think too much. Zurich's urban fabric tells a fascinating story. Many of its steep, gridded streets were laid out long before the advent of the private car. Their fundamental purpose was to provide efficient housing for a workforce that largely commuted on foot or public transport and didn't need to maneuver heavy cargo. Consequently, you'll observe a distinct pattern. Flat areas boast a dense grid for industry and residential, whereas the hillsides are generally characterized by gentler slopes with residential homes. The steeper sections up on the hills tend to be remnants of former farmlands or historic worker neighborhoods, where walking was the primary mode of transport. Fast forward a few years, and it turns out that when you let what is essentially community-led street design, you get slopes and layouts that are appropriate for the topography and human use, instead of these rubbish hillsides where you just absolutely avoid cycling unless you have to. So it now begs the question, what do we do about existing steep streets? How do we make them more accessible for cyclists and mobility-impaired people? Has the damage already been done? Is it fixable? Fortunately, or perhaps unfortunately, we don't yet have a strong-handed leader who's willing to tear up the existing urban fabric to fix poorly planned, hilly streets in the name of better cycling infrastructure. So instead, we'll have to rely on practical policy decisions. And in this case, well, the obvious answer is the cyclist yeet cannon in Trondheim, Norway. Now, as cool as it seems to just turn up and be shot up a steep hill, it's a highly specific solution, but it doesn't scale well and has some restrictions in application with regard to street design, scalability, and usability. Really, the most obvious solution to steep hills are simply e-bikes or electrical mobility. The wheelchair users can also use it to get up the steep hill, and on the way down, I guess they let Jesus take the wheel and race down without brakes? But seriously, e-bikes have been the biggest solution to biking hills, but it's not the only solution. It has opened up hills to nearly everyone, and often in the middle of mountains in Switzerland, you'll find pensioners getting their exercise with the help of e-bikes. It's the most obvious, practical, and cost-effective solution. Though, for those who can't afford an e-bike, I guess it's stiff shit. Here's another solution for hills: topography-specific public transport. Yeah, sure, buses and the like can just drive us up, but they have to go up windy roads, and if the roads follow the topography of the hill, you can't feasibly run a bus line on every parallel street. So either wheelchair users have to go the long way around, or magically discovered walking again to go up some stairs. So we need to tailor the solution a little bit more. I present to you the funicular or cogwheel train. These are great because they take you up to the level you need to go as fast and direct as possible, and they're often very easy to automate or make automatic and remotely controlled. Because what you can do with your funiculars is you've got these parallel streets, and you just have the funicular have a stop at each street, and you just go up, take the funicular to the stop, and walk along the street you need to get to. Quite simple. Zurich has 2 funiculars and 1 cogwheel train. But other cities that solve the steep hill problem using specific public transport are Lausanne with their rubber-tired metro going from the lakeshore up to the main station, and Lugano that has a funicular from the main station down to the, you guessed it, lakeshore in Old Town. But probably one of the simplest public transport solutions to navigate a steep hill is the humble elevator or escalator. I mean, if these things can take you from one building floor to another, surely you can apply them in the hills. Escalators are not uncommon in hilly cities. They offer high-capacity transport, but they are unsuitable for wheelchair users and can be costly to maintain, particularly when exposed to weather conditions, for a capacity in excess of what is necessary. Therefore, they don't really offer much difference than the humble stairs. Elevators, on the other hand, while suitable for wheelchairs, their capacity isn't that high, are also expensive to maintain and very expensive to build, as you either need to jut the walkway structure out over the terrain or dig a tunnel into the terrain and put the shaft up. And they also often stink of piss, as they are by nature an enclosed public cubicle. But they do have their application and aren't uncommon in Switzerland. If by any chance you happen to be skiing in Zermatt and you want to go up this hotel for après-ski drinks drinks, but you're staying down in the town? Well, your options are walk 900 meters, approximately 155 Dodge Rams long, up and around, or pay an expensive micro-electric cab just to end up about 150 meters where you started. There's no bus because the narrow roads really don't permit that. But here's the cool option. Walk down this random tunnel about 180 meters into the mountain, at which point you will find an elevator that will whisk you all the way up above the plebs to allow you to get sufficiently boozed. It is such a cool idea, and the fact that you have to go into a mountain in order to appear up on top makes it feel like a James Bond villain layer, or like in the 1971 Willy Wonka film where Willy Wonka took his
The Wonkavator.
Yeah, it's a pretty cool solution to be shot up and out of the factory, but that's not the main reason why this was built. Usually at the end of popular ski runs, you expect to get back onto a lift to go back up the mountain. Do you see any lifts here? No? Well, that's because the ski lift is underground. So when you ski down this track, you get in the elevator down and you turn right and you'll find a fully underground funicular that takes you back up the mountain. Now that's two public transport options combined together. It's just so crazy that in this rich ski resort, you'll find ingenious transport solutions hidden among picturesque village. Okay, yes, on the topic of skiing, some of you might be screaming, "What about cable cars?" into the screen, and I hear you. They are very effective to transport lots of people on difficult terrain, but they're very, very expensive if you don't have enough demand willing to pay for it. They are great, but also a very specific and limited solution. I mean, in the case of here in Zermatt, they couldn't really drive a cable car directly into the town, so they had to pretty much go underground, which only left a funicular as the option. But expensive infrastructure solutions aside, the best way to improve steep hill cycling is, honestly, just to make cycling everywhere else suck less. Steep hills are a very niche problem in barriers to cycling, but they represent a larger problem at play here, and that is urban design for people, not cars. I guess if you do have a steep hill to cycle, a grade separated bike lane definitely helps a lot and reduces the speed differential gap and physical gap between you and passing cars. And for the love of God, please remove parked cars that can allow dooring at fast speeds. This shit is deadly. So, there it is. Yes, hills are a barrier to cycling, and Zurich has mostly inadvertently overcome most of it. Not just by creating a good cycling culture across the whole city, but by historic streets designed and laid out by the community over hundreds of years as the least exhausting way to get around without a large motor pushing you around. Whilst in Brisbane, the streets were just plonked down willy-nilly, disregarding any organically delineated pathways across the tricky topography, resulting in frustratingly repetitive steep hills that, combined with the already terrible cycling infrastructure, makes the commuter cycling experience much worse. So, if you like my content, please don't forget to comment and subscribe. It really helps my case when I tell my mum I have online friends. And yeah, the algorithm, I guess. If you've lasted until the very end of this video, first of all, thank you very much. Well done. And second of all, sorry for the delay in the videos coming out in the next one. I was quite a bit busy in my life, but yeah, some of that's cleared up. So, we Thunderbirds are go for the next few videos that come out at a bit higher frequency. So, stay tuned.